Hey guys, Dr. Mitch Earlywine here. We're going to start with the drug class categories of drugs, classes and categories. I love the slide. I say, hey, what's this? And everybody yells out, your brain on drugs. This was a PSA drug prevention effort, 1987. I was already in grad school, so I, of course, knew better, but I think everybody pretty much knew this was a bunch of nonsense. My friends at Drug Policy Alliance made another one that was about drug policy reform instead. We'll get into it when we get to prevention. And this is your brain on drugs with a side of bacon. And so I'd often open with a question like this: which of these would you want for pain? Well, opiates, sedatives, or anxiolytics. Obviously, opiates have the stronger anxiolytic properties. And basically, this is how we're going to divide drugs into categories, in part because they're based on their subjective effects. But with that in mind, we want to make sure we know other contributors to subjective effects. So we'll get into that. And here's another intriguing question. If you can answer this already, that's great. But which of these is an inhalant? Cocaine, amphetamine, or ether? And obviously it's ether. And again, this is very typical of the kinds of questions you'll see on the exam. I realize this is an easy one, but this is what we're trying to go for: is can we tell different drugs in which category they belong? Or if I give you a drug, can you tell me which category? The other thing I want to emphasize is an understanding of causality, and we'll get into that in this lecture. So we're going to divide drugs by their effects. That's one way to create a taxonomic system. Every situation, every categorization system has its drawbacks, right? No matter what happens, you end up with a platypus, right? He's got warm blood, but he swims and has webbed feet and lays eggs, and he's like, hey, Darwin, and kind of flips him off. Like, it's just doesn't quite fit in any one category, right? Obviously, it's really Carlos Linnaeus he's flipping off, but the bottom line is you're going to find some drugs that don't necessarily fit perfectly into a category, and that's in part because almost all drugs are dirty drugs, have multiple effects on multiple systems. But we want to get at that because we want to know, okay, causality is an important thing to understand for which drug creates which effects, but also when we're going to talk about chronic effects of drugs, we don't want to blame a drug for an effect that is actually a product of socioeconomic status or poor health or some correlate of drug use. And we want to sort of keep that in mind as we classify drugs into categories, if only to have a shorthand, if only for us to be able to communicate with each other in a way that we can lump drugs together and get the big point across. This is one part, probably this first exam is the only one where it does maybe give you a slight advantage if you've done some drugs, but don't count on it. And by all means, if you've never done any drugs, these are easy to learn. Give yourself a little time and you can make it happen. So if we are going to divide drugs up by category, obviously we want to keep in mind of alternative contributors to these drug effects. So first and foremost, the setting. We're also going to talk about experience, expectancy, and physical condition. So what's up with setting? Well, obviously, if you do drugs in different environments, you're going to have different effects. So my graduate advisor, may his soul rest in peace, Dr. Richard David Young, was in one of the first studies of LSD. And he said, I'm never doing that drug again. It was awful. It makes you paranoid. You feel weird. It's awful. And I said, well, tell me about it. So he said, I was sitting there. I'm the only one taking the drug. Everybody else is standing around in a white coat saying, how do you feel now? How do you feel now? How do you feel now? Needless to say, that is not conducive to a peak experience on a hallucinogen. So obviously the setting is contributing. You can imagine using cannabis at home in front of the TV with a nice bowl of soup, or trying to use it in, say, a police station. Clearly you're going to have different subjective effects emphasized. Experience also contributes to drug effects, primarily because of tolerance, cross-tolerance, or just familiarity with different states of consciousness. So as you can imagine, some of you may still remember the one beer buzz, right? When you've never had alcohol before, A relatively small dose is certainly going to get you to a different subjective state. I'm sure it's good for everybody's budget to go back to the one beer buzz. And if you would take a month off from alcohol, odds are high some of that sensitivity would come right back. But we can't count on a measure of a drug's effect if we try to generalize from people who are already heavy chronic users. Another important contributor is expectancy. Most drugs do what users expect them to, right? And the only way to get around this is to use placebo control. So you can imagine here, if I randomly assign half of the class to, say, get cannabis, the other half to get placebo, and then everybody uses it, and I say, okay, how do you feel now? The placebo group will tell us what happens if you only expect to get cannabis, not if you're having the pharmacological exposure to THC and other cannabinoids itself. Now, in my lab, we have had some success with this with cannabis, but only for brief periods and pretty much only with oral administration. Alcohol at relatively low doses, you can have reasonable placebos. For our psychiatric meds, we've got good placebos. Other drugs, it's really tough. So, I mean, what am I going to use for a psilocybin placebo group unless I'm using folks who've never used psilocybin before and really trying to set up an environment well? It can be a tough one. Tim Leary used a niacin, I think. Like, you just got to do the best you can with what you've got. But let's remember that expectancies definitely contribute. And finally, physical condition, just raw body mass. Are you currently fatigued? Those things obviously contribute. So I weigh probably 160 today. I'm going to drink 2 beers. Somebody who weighs only 90 pounds is obviously going to have a more dramatic experience unless he or she has a whole lot of tolerance. And that alone is going to contribute as well. So let's keep these in mind when we talk about subjective effects of drugs and dividing them into categories. And I really do want you to understand causality, because this is going to come up time and again. And our best explanations of causality go back to Dave Hume, and he did live in the 1700s. Do not memorize his birth date and death date. Like, that's not what matters. He's one of the British empiricists, great philosopher, definitely worth reading. But he said, look, there are really 3 components to the way we describe causal reasoning. First and foremost, association. What do I mean by association? The cause and the effect have to go together, right? If I'm going to say that mushrooms cure depression, then we should have mushrooms come first and improve depression to go with it. The second one I'm going to talk about, even though it's not on the list here in a second, is direction. By direction, I just mean temporal antecedents. What comes first? The cause has to come before the effect, right? I used to have these fun gymnastics guys. One guy was really big, and he would run over and jump and land right by the little guy who would then do a flip. And it created this illusion that he had somehow made the little guy do a flip. And it shows an error in our causal reasoning, when really what had happened was this guy just decided, right? And we got lulled into that because it had an association of direction, but it was missing one more thing: isolation, right? You've got to make sure the cause, and only the cause, is creating the effect. And how do we get at that? We got to do an experiment, right? We're going to have to randomly assign some folks to get the alleged cause and some folks to not get it in order to really make any kind of causal argument, right? So association, cause and effect have to go together. Isolation, it's the cause and only the cause contributing. And direction, the cause has to come first in order to create the effect, which should come second. Well, how do we really get at this? Our best arguments are experiments. And you guys have had this beaten into you since intro, and I will put this on pretty much every exam, and we'll see if folks finally all get it. But the bottom line is I'm going to manipulate one variable and measure its effects on another. Now let's think about this. Again, if I randomly assign folks to use cannabis or placebo, and then I have them fill out a mood questionnaire, which one is which? Well, independent of them, right? Independent of who they are. I, as the experimenter, I'm going to say, you're going to get cannabis, you're going to get placebo, right? The dependent variable depends on what they say, right? The participants are then going to say, here's how I feel, right? So it really depends on them, right? My hope is that it depends on the alleged cause, in this case, the cannabis. All other work and a lot of work in drugs is really correlational. I'm just going to call those a study rather than an experiment. So if people say, hey, I got a study that shows A goes with B, but I didn't actually randomly assign it, we're going to call that correlational. And the causal arguments are harder to make. Let me give you an example. Right? Hey, you know what correlates really highly? The number of churches in a city and crime in a city. Maybe churches cause crime. Well, no, I don't think that. And then occasionally one of you will raise your hand and say, maybe people can't stand crime and so they start churches, right? I like that one as much as anything, right? But truth be told, there's a third variable explanation. There's an important confound, and that's that the size of the city is really accounting for this relation between these variables, right? Big cities have more churches and have more crime. Smaller cities have fewer churches and less crime in the long run on the average, right? So all we have is a correlation there. I can't make an argument that churches cause crime, right? Every time we're talking about a finding, let's make sure we understand, is this a causal argument or is it only correlational, and go from there. So with that in mind, I want to get into the individual drug categories. Obviously, there are lots of different ways to divide things up. I don't want to go by neurotransmitter system yet or anything that complicated. I just want to give broad strokes so we can get a sense for drug classes, drug categories, so that when I say one, you and I are thinking the exact same thing. So here's some sedative, stimulant, narcotic, hallucinogens, inhalants, and then others. Basically, all the platypi, so to speak. Right there, a couple that just don't fit. We'll also get into some psychiatric meds, and I just want you to be able to recognize those when you see them. Now, I'm going to list them all. You'll want to be able to say which one goes in which category, and that's going to do it. For the history part, just get what's the oldest, right? When did we first get a feel for this drug? When did someone isolate it, or when was it discovered in nature? And that's going to do the job for the test. All right, I'm going to start with the stimulants just because, hey, I like them. Bottom line, these are some of the more popular ones, right? Caffeine and nicotine are among the most widely used drugs worldwide. But then there are major stimulants, right? Sort of hard ones like cocaine and amphetamine. And these are going to have hallmark effects acutely and chronically, and you'll know them when you see them. But bottom line is these are stimulating, right? They're going to increase heart rate. They're going to often awaken people. So typical advantage of these, cocaine. This is an obvious example. Coca leaves go back to at least 2500 BC. Odds are high way before then. We just don't have good archaeological evidence. But certainly in South America, people have chewed coca leaves for millennia. And this is pretty much what the leaves look like. If you saw this growing in my backyard, well, they couldn't grow in my backyard. This is Albany. Things are too cold here, right? But it doesn't look like anything particularly exotic or wild. This is actually about the size of the leaves. Each leaf is about 2% coca, but we'll get into that cocaine. But we'll get into that when we do the chapter on this. I want to emphasize that cocaine has some local anesthetic properties, right? In some ways, it can cure pain. So they used to be in toothache drops. Everybody would give these to their babies when they were teething, that kind of thing. Then Mariani, which was basically cocaine dissolved in rather trashy French wine. And then you'd have cocaine and alcohol together. We'll get into that as well. This is the dreaded crack. So a smokable form. Obviously, the mode of administration is going to make the impact different, but we'll get into that when we get into physiological effects. But cocaine is sort of a typical major stimulant. All right, so here's a stereotypical item you might see on an exam. When did Hume live? I'm going to only have 3 options, but obviously you know it's in the 1700s. And how far back do coca leaves go? And we're going to pick the 2500 BC. I realize I have year 0 as an option here. There is no year 0. Just keep that in mind. Amphetamine. All right. Well, amphetamine actually is a synthetic version of a plant called ephedra or mahuang. Right? And I really love talking about mahuang. Mahuang is just the greatest thing. Yeah, nothing like talking about mahuang. But it goes back to 2800 BC. It's the Emperor Shenang gets credit for it. We'll talk about him some more because he's also probably the discoverer of cannabis and caffeinated tea, but he's more like the Johnny Appleseed of the Asian countries, right? If you can remember that date, that's going to do the trick. But ephedrine and then synthetic versions of ephedrine came later, and we'll get into that when we get into the amphetamine chapter. One of the most prevalent stimulants is Ritalin. You guys also see a lot of Adderall, apparently. And Ritalin does actually have an impact on ADHD. We'll get into that when we do the amphetamine chapter. This is just a frightening slide of how folks make meth. Obviously, you don't want to put this in your body if it's some redneck has taken Drano and matches and worked on it. But we'll get into this when we do the major stimulants. The ubiquitous caffeine. I have to confess, I am on this drug right now. This goes back to 2737 BC. Also, good old Shenang gets credit for this and is present in Camellia sinensis. What is that? Of course, that's black tea. In 850 AD, Arabian goat herder Causality basically saw his goats jumping around like a bunch of goats and identified coffee beans. And Quetzalcoatl, the South American deity who gave us cocoa beans. And obviously, if you love chocolate, you know, of course, it came from a deity. But again, we've got caffeine here. Please go ahead and focus on this 2737 BC and then 850 AD for coffee. Some folks say 750, but you'll sort of know that's when Causality got the coffee going. And this is a minor stimulant, works in a different neurotransmitter system, and so we'll get into that when we do the stimulants. So this is my daughter, who's now actually a sophomore at another college, and she would kill me if she knew I had this slide up. But I want to emphasize that caffeine is a weight-based dose, and so in some ways, little kids should not have this. They're going to be much more responsive because they don't have the lean body mass. Now, obviously, I didn't let her drink a Red Bull at this age. I just thought it would be a fun picture for this class. I used to have more hair, too. All right, well, so what are the acute effects? And this is how we kind of divide them up. Well, elation, and that's just a fancy word for being happy, and then all those physiological signs of heightened arousal, right? So tachycardia, what's that mean? Faster heart rate. Sweating, right? We either detect that from GSR, galvanic skin resistance, and pupil dilation, right? So if a stimulant's going to open those pupils up, and we'll get into this more when we get to the physiology chapters, but pupils are going to be wide open. And we do have some data suggesting that people think people with wide pupils look happy and look more friendly and maybe even more attractive depending upon the data. So don't let stimulants confuse you. No need to get married or make big decisions if you've done a stimulant recently. So in contrast to the acute effects, we've got some rather disturbing chronic effects. So after multiple days of use, particularly of the major stimulants, we see psychotic symptoms, right? People start hearing voices, start believing unbelievable stuff. formication. All right, and this will probably be on the test, so do learn this. This is a subjective effect of long-term stimulant use. You feel like bugs are crawling under your skin. Basically, you see those meth pictures where people have obviously scratched themselves. That seems to be part of that. You see a lot of irritability, but I think it's a product of the sleep disturbance, right? If you haven't slept for 3 days, of course you're going to be irritable. And then tons of paranoia. And this can be complicated clinically because, somebody comes to the VA and tells me he's got guys chasing him with guns. I don't know if it's because he's having a psychotic break because of stimulants or if he ripped off a meth dealer. So don't want to jump to judgment on that. But this is pretty much a good index of long-term chronic use of any of the major stimulants. Now, do we get this with caffeine and nicotine? Well, the withdrawal symptoms certainly have that irritability, and they definitely disturb sleep. We want to just keep that in mind. All right, I'm going to quit here, and we'll pick up on the sedatives next. This is a little shorter, but a good time for you to take a break, write yourself a couple of questions, and, dance around, watch comedy for 5 minutes, and then come back and we're going to pick up with the sedatives and kick it in on the different drug categories. Thanks so much.